Thanks again, everyone, for joining us this afternoon on today's Enterprise Solutions webinar. This is the webinar 2 of 3 in our series, Happy User, Happy IT. And the webinar series really is focusing on what DEX is, how it impacts you, how it impacts environments, and how you can leverage that to make your users happy. And if your users happy, the IT are happy, and everyone's life is better. In webinar 1, we had Simon Townsend from ControlUp, and we discussed the concept of what DEX is, how you can build DEX maturity within your organization, and what are some of the tools that you can use then to measure that DEX metrics for your user. Today, we're going to switch gears a little bit, and you'll notice it's, the title is the foundation to improve your DEX. And what do we mean by the foundation for that? So really what we're talking about is, every EUC environment is built somewhere. So starting from the ground up with a good solid foundation, you're able to build a platform that is going to be performative, resilient, scalable, securable, to ensure that you're giving your users the best possible experience. Today, because we're living in what we all know now is a hybrid world, organizations have a need for both running workloads in public cloud, and they also have a need to run workloads on-prem. It seems like only a few years ago we thought everything was going one direction or the other, but the world has slowly come to its senses and realized no, everybody's got a use case for both. So with that being said, the two platforms that we're going to be discussing today for getting our foundation so that we can get a good DEX experience will be Azure and Nutanix. So I'm delighted to welcome our two guest speakers with us today. We have Kirillos Akram, who's a senior cloud architect with Microsoft, and we have Kees Baggerman, senior director of engineering, EUC Nutanix. So guys, Kirillos, would you like to just introduce yourself there, please?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Carlos, and I'm a cloud architect at Microsoft. I've been working there for 18 months, and before that, I had almost like 10 years of experience with other cloud providers and international organizations. So I'm happy to be here today and be part of this call and webinar, and hopefully we can explain how to build your architecture from the ground up correctly.
Thanks, Kirillos. Kees, can you give us the quick rundown?
Well, the quick rundown, that's going to be a challenge. No, so my name is Kees Baggerman. I work for Nutanix. I've been with Nutanix for almost 10 years. Before that, I worked at a privately owned system integrator as a solution architect for end user computing. And I now lead a team of very, very smart engineers and architects worldwide that help us. And when I say us, Nutanix, in 3 different areas. One is improving the product. So that means that we'll test and regression test our products and see if we can make it better. Evangelizing, which means that we'll be speaking at events like Citrix Synergy in the past, but also VMworld, Nutanix.next, our own event. We write reference architectures, best practice guide, and solution notes around end user computing. And then the last piece is reducing sales friction. So when there's a large or complex strategic deal on the line, field teams can pull us in and we'll try to help as much as we can. So DEX, like it or not, is a fundamental part of what we do, as user experience is always key in all of our conversations in all 3 of these topics.
Right, thanks, Kees. Great to have you here today. So, as I said, we're discussing, the 2 approaches here. One is, public cloud. The other is on-prem. So, like, if we were first talk about, about Azure, based on your experience when preparing to deploy an EUC environment in Azure, what's the most important factor that an organization should take into account when they're designing their architecture for this?
Yeah, I think it's as simple as answering one question: am I architecting my my environment right from the beginning? And that's why I think it's a good idea to dive deeper into the Azure well-architected framework. And with the Azure well-architected framework, it's a framework where Azure and Microsoft share best practices for building like the right architecture from day one or maybe day zero, and just in the in exploring your environment first. So it has 5 pillars. We have cost optimization, operational excellence, performance efficiency, reliability, and security. And very quickly, I'll just give you a hint around each of these pillars. For cost optimization, you need to ask your team and your IT department, are we building this with a cost efficient in our mind? Are we using pay as you go offering, or do we need to invest in hardware in our own premises? You need to have kind of a set of questions that you work with your team and understand. Will you prefer going for a public cloud like Microsoft and start building and only pay as you go, and you don't need to have kind of um, OpEx or CapEx at the beginning, or you like prefer to invest in an on-premise environment? Again, we also have the operational excellence. Operational excellence here means you design with automation in mind. So you have kind of automated pipeline and automated deployments where you deploy your infrastructure or whatever application automatically. So you don't need to have a human interaction or intervention into that process. For performance efficiency, do you design your environment and you know that each couple of months, each couple of years, you need to pay for maintenance, you need to like invest again into updating your environment or not? So that's why performance efficiency as well, it allows you to design and you prepare for low maintenance cost, improving user experience and focus into your application. Reliability, but like it means that you can maybe scale out instead of scaling up, and that's making your application stateless. So you don't need to have this worry around high availability or failures and so on. And for sure, security, which is a main pillar in the well-architected framework, where you start building from scratch, everything secure, and security should be your first job in any architecture, either it's on-premise or in the cloud. So moving forward, talking about well-architected framework, we need to clarify that it's a shared responsibility. It's not only on the Azure part of things, it's also from the customer environment. So you need to build your architecture and having this shared responsibility mindset. So Azure provides you the tools to secure your environment, to maybe monitor your costs, to make your application highly available, but you need to do the configuration. We have the tools, you need to find the best set of tools to use. And for underneath your like infrastructure in Azure, it's also maintained by Azure. So you don't need to focus on to maybe securing the data centers, like or securing the network for your servers. Like in a cloud environment, you will be more focused into your application, how to secure them, how to make them highly available, instead of focusing into the actual servers and data centers.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that you mentioned there on the first slide was around, cost optimization. So, when you're building a workload in somewhere like Azure, where pretty much you're not constrained by resources, it can be very tempting to start using very large virtual machine SKUs, to start using very fast premium disks, things like that. And given that the compute cost, makes up pretty much the largest chunk of the bill for an EUC workload, how does an organization sanity check itself so that it's still making the workload as performative as possible, but still kind of making themselves stay within their budget and get that financial balancing act correct?
Yeah, exactly, Sean. And that's why I think we need to talk about the trade-offs. So in terms of if you're designing maybe for a development workload or a dev test environment, you might not you might don't want to spend too much, right? So you might maybe work into cost optimization and maybe drop reliability. So you don't need to have high availability, for example, if it's not a mission critical application. On the other hand, if you're developing maybe a mission critical application, you might need to focus into reliability, high performance, and for sure based on your business requirement. And this might get you into like improving the performance at the cost of maybe paying more for like a larger SKU of virtual machine or another disk types that allows more network bandwidths or less latency and so on. But anyway, if you choose to kind of focus on reliability, drop cost optimization, or maybe work into high availability environment, you need to focus into security. So security will be the ground layer for all choices that you make. And it's not only the trade-offs. And when we talk about cost optimization, and maybe if we go to the next slide as well, as I mentioned, Microsoft has the right tools for you. So you can build your budget alerts. You can say, for example, I don't want to pay more than 500 euros a month, for example, for my EUC environment or whatever. So you can build your budget alerts. And based on these budget alerts, you will be notified beforehand that maybe you're forecasted to reach this by end of the month. And you can go back and work with your IT department and try to tweak things to maybe avoid higher spend. But it's not only about alerts. We have the concept of scaling. The auto scaling policy can be in place. So you don't need to scale up or maybe add more resources to the same virtual machine or the same environment. You can maybe scale out. And sometimes this will save cost. It will save it will save you a huge chunk of money if you're focusing on scale out instead of scaling up. And when you have a requirement that requires you to scale, you can scale. But if there is no need to have maybe hundreds of virtual machines, you can scale them down. And this is the beauty of public clouds. It's kind of auto scaling policy. And finally, we have also the concept of reservation. If you know that you will maybe have a kind of a base for your environment, let's say that you need at least 10 virtual machines with specific requirements, you might need to reserve them, and you can maybe save up to 70% over the pay-as-you-go pricing. And if you need more than 10 virtual machines, for example, you can pay as you go for the additional virtual machine. So you have a base with reservation, and then any additional virtual machine or compute resources can be as a pay as you go. So like we have so many tools, and it's the decisions that you make and the trade-offs that you choose for your environment.
Yeah. And what's interesting there is one of the things you said about, cost optimization, a factor to take into is whether you need high availability and things like that. But like when it comes to building your architecture in Azure, availability has so many different options. You've got availability regions, availability sets, virtual machine scale sets. If you look at your storage, you're talking, local redundant, zone redundant, geo zone redundant. How do you architecturally get your head around this and what you should be using?
Yeah, and I think we're talking here about reliability. And as I mentioned, you need to be designing for reliability. You need to design your application in a way that, if you have a requirement for fault tolerance, that means that your RTO or RPO, you can't maybe allow more than 5 minutes downtime in a month. So again, it's based on the requirement. It's based on the user requirement. If you're building a mission critical application and you really require highly available environment, then we're talking about building a fault or a failure resistant design. And in such case, you will need maybe to utilize multiple availability zones, multiple availability sets, virtual machine scale sets to scale your environment, and so on. But not only into the compute options, in the storage option as well. You can pick the right SKU based on the requirement. So you don't need maybe a G-redundant if your application maybe is only hosted in one region, right? So having the right choice. I know sometimes it can be very difficult to pick the right SKU for the virtual machine and the storage, but getting them right from day one allows you to build successfully and reliable and have a reliable application and reliable architecture.
That's pretty good stuff. Without naming names, are there any real world examples of of an organization that didn't plan their architecture properly and some of the problems that they've run into then?
Well, I might not be able to share the exact story, but if you go to the next slide, Sean, I'll explain here how much it would cost you if you had a data breach, for example. So this is from an IPM report they published, and they were kind of studying.
No, I think we lost Carlos there.
Maybe we should talk about availability zones and resiliency in Zoom sessions.
Yes, Zoom does not have the same level of HA, I guess. Oh, I guess we'll move on. Hopefully he can rejoin at some stage. Case, one of the things I touched on there with Carlos was around the workload sizing. When you're in the public cloud, as I said, you kind of unlimited to a certain extent. You can keep going, but when you're dealing like with an on-prem Nutanix deployment, you are going to have a certain limited amount of resources available. What's the methodology that you would have with a customer when you're approaching them around the workload sizing and getting the best value out of their investment?
Got it. So in general, I'd say that resource allocation for Nutanix is something that might seem as a limited amount of resources or a fixed set, as you said. But the whole concept of what we do and the way that we've done it is that we give you the opportunity to define units of scale. So that means that the typical approach that we'll take is to find what a node would do. So if you look at the way that Nutanix is bringing public cloud into your on-prem data center, is to have services that encompasses similar to what you would see in public cloud, but on-prem. We'll talk in terms of nodes or servers. So if we're talking about units of scale, then that's a node. And the way that our architecture is built is that it scales linearly. So that means that we know, and that's what you can see in our reference architectures and Nutanix validated designs, that when we defined a certain number of users per node, then we can replicate that up to hundreds, thousands, or 10,000s of desktops if you like. So that's typically the way that we approach it. We'll find that unit of scale depending on the use case for that particular subset of users. Right, because you cannot just assume that if we approach a company that they're all the same. It's not. That's just an illusion. It's not gonna work for you. So that means you have to define user profiles or user personas or whatever you want to call them, but unique identifiers for that subset of resource consumption, and then you can build out units of scale and say, well, for this amount of users with this particular profile, you need this amount of resources on-prem. Now, the good thing about the Nutanix stack is that it's modular. So that means that you can mix and match. If you have GPU use cases, you can add GPU resources in your cluster. You can have servers or nodes with a GPU or without a GPU. You can have high spec CPUs or lower spec CPUs, depending on where you want to find that balance between. Because if I look at DEX from an infrastructure perspective, on Nutanix, there's two things that, there's a couple of things that you need to incorporate. You'd have Neto storage capacity. How much can I store on my disk? We're talking about I/O and latency. We're talking about memory, and then there's CPU. The first four are not typically a Nutanix problem. We've got you covered on Neto capacity. We've got you covered on IOPS. We've got you covered on latency. That's relatively easy for Nutanix to do desktop virtualization from these perspectives. Memory is straightforward to calculate with. Then there's CPU. The CPU is always kind of perceived as black magic, voodoo-like technology or approach. But if you look at it, it comes down to two things. one is clock speeds, the other one is number of cores. Number of cores is important for density. Clock speed is important for user experience.
Yep.
So typically when we go in for sizing, it's going to be 2.5 gigahertz or higher for a regular use case. If we're talking about high-end use cases where we see a lot of single-threaded applications, which we sadly still see around, then we're talking about higher clock speeds because that equals a better performance for that end user. Typically, they're lower in numbers in terms of actual users that need that high clock speed capacity, but that's where we need to find a balance, right? It's number of cores. Often the higher you go, the lower the clock speed will be. So that means that we can get very high density, but at a trade-off in terms of performance. On the flip side, we'll have very high clock speed, but lower core, so lower density on for that particular subset. So that's where we find the balance. And that's where I think we should start every single IT project is put that user central and then start looking at what they would need in terms of fulfilling their requirements. So similar to what Kirillos was just saying is make sure that you size up front, make sure that you understand what the user does and not just sit there from your ivory tower, but be actively engaged with that user. Just to give you an example, we had a customer that was investing in Nutanix. They came from a traditional 3-tier infrastructure. The time that they saved by using Nutanix as their infrastructure to build up the infrastructure just to keep the lights on, they used that to sit at the, this was a hospital, by the way. They used to use that time to sit with their employees, to go to the work floor, to sit with nurses and doctors and be with them and see how they operate. And it turns out that they were very inefficient with roaming their sessions. So what they saw was that a nurse was logging in, logging out every bed. And we know that there are solutions for that. But if the user base is not reporting this as a problem, they just accepted the fact that they were losing time.
Yep.
It was considered as normal. IT saw that because they had the time to sit with them and said, you know, we actually have a solution to solve the problem that you have. You might not perceive it as a problem, but there's a solution for this. And that meant that just by seeing what the users were doing, they shaved off about 25 seconds of login time at each patient visit. And this is a 15,000 seat deployment. So that, you know, you can do the math on how much time that saved for this particular customer just by having the time and see what their end users were doing.
Yeah, that's really cool stuff. One of the things you touched on there when you were talking about the unit of scale and understanding the user persona and their requirements is going to be their profiles and their data, things like that. If that's not performative from the beginning, you're already fighting a losing battle. And I think Nutanix really have got a great solution already built in for this, right?
Yeah, I know exactly where you're going. So Nutanix is known for the HCI platform that we brought, right? Converging storage, compute into one solution and then offering that as a overall stack. What we soon discovered was that because of our architecture, we're very well suited for desktop virtualization. But with that, there's a few other bits and pieces that come along with it to make it a very optimal platform, and that's what brought up Files, which is a file server solution that's built into the cluster itself, or can be hosted on an external cluster, but it offers NFS or SMB as an external share. Now, if you think about it, offering an SMB share that sits on the same cluster as your desktops, bringing apps and data as close as possible together in the execution platform, isn't that just the optimal platform? Like that's the whole thought process for me about around desktop virtualization is having execution platform, applications, and data as close together as we can. Now add in profiles as close as we can to that desktop, and suddenly you have high performing desktop, right? Because it's all tied in, it's close to each other. You don't have to traverse the network with like 4 or 5 hops. There's no finger pointing. The amount of cases that I've seen in the past where Citrix is slow or VMware is slow, and then you go and have a look, and it turns out that the profile load is like 2.5 minutes with wonderful tools like Control Up or EG or any of the tools that are out there, you can actually see that it's the profile. And if it's stored on an external storage box that the virtualization team or maybe even the desktop team doesn't have access to, then there's friction. Bringing that into the solution actually makes a lot of sense. We did extensive testing with FSLogix and CPM, which is documented. So if you want to have a look, it's on portal.nutanix.com. If you go to solutions documentation, people like Dave Brett and James Skinden, Jarian Gibson, all three of them are Citrix technology professionals. James is also an MVP in enterprise mobility. So these guys know what they're talking about. They've done extensive testing on these solutions. And what you will see is that files is written, it's a well-written feature. Whatever we were throwing at it, it would work exactly the way that we wanted. Continuous availability, access-based enumeration, all encryption, all these features would run without too much impact, and thus, offering a optimal solution for that end user.
Yeah. Having used it myself for EUC deployments, the fact that even by default it just comes with high availability, deploys 3 nodes automatically. It really does make life a lot easier.
And what's great is that if we look at the roadmap for example files, we get direct input to their roadmap. So one of the features that you'll see coming is something that we call VDI sync, which is basically follow me data. So that means that if I have, let's say I'm based in the Netherlands, we've got an office in Rotterdam and one in Utrecht. There's about 60 kilometers difference there. If in the morning I'm working from the offices in Rotterdam, I get the data served out of the infrastructure that's in Rotterdam. If I decide that I have an appointment later that day in Utrecht, I just close off my desktop, drive over to Utrecht, and get the data, the latest version of that data offered from the data center in Utrecht, right? That, again, to the proximity, the data gravity problem that we've all been trying to solve, that's one piece that we can solve now. And that's because of the input that we were allowed to give on this roadmap, and obviously the great engineering and PM teams that were listening to us. They said, you know what, this is actually something that customers are asking for, and we're able to build stuff like that.
Is that gone GA yet, or is that just on the roadmap?
It's close to GA.
Close to GA. Okay, looking forward to checking it out. As we mentioned at the top of the webinar, Nutanix is here today because you were the on-premise kind of representative of this, but you do have integration with Azure using Nutanix Cloud Clusters. Could you give the attendees more of an understanding of what that is and what the benefits are?
Absolutely. It was one of these things that I got really excited with when I saw the first demos. So what you will see is that the core foundation of Nutanix is to bring public cloud into an on-prem environment. But obviously, we're not blind to where the industry is going, and hybrid multi-cloud is the way to go. So what we've done is we utilize the bare metal services offerings that Microsoft has in their data centers, and you can actually run our software on top of these Azure bare metal instances. So that means that you can tap into your Microsoft Azure commits that you have, take control of these bare metal instances. We've got the automation and the framework to actually deploy our software into these bare metal instances. And it operates like you are used to as an on-prem environment. So you don't need to have additional skill sets. You're consuming the services that Microsoft has from the different regions, so you don't have to maintain and develop these data center capacities in these different locations. You can just basically flip a switch and be online in the Microsoft Azure regions that we have these bare metal offerings. Same look and feel, same tool set, same skill set. And that to me is very important, because if you look at the previous slide from Kirillos, in terms of all the components that we have to maintain and have a look at, that requires a lot of skill sets, right? That requires a lot of training, experience, making sure that you actually understand the technology correctly. What if we have an abstraction layer on top of that, which offers you that same look and feel, that same tool set, that same skill set? You don't have to worry that much. And I'm not saying you should ignore it, but you don't have to worry that much around the technology that's under the stack, under the hood, because you can focus on day one, day two operations now with
Yeah.
NC2. And it offers you the ability to do true hybrid cloud, have
Yeah.
an on-prem environment, have resources running in that on-prem environment, and move to Azure with that abstraction layer without refactoring your golden images. So if we think about this in an EUC context or even a DEX context, there's no better thing than making sure that user perceived performance is consistent by not touching the golden image. And that's exactly what we're doing with NC2. We're extending what we have on-prem into public cloud without refactoring the golden image, without touching the infrastructure. It's literally the same VM running on spot A, running on spot B on that different moment in time that we can control.
Yeah, one of the biggest problems is you always say it's configuration drift if you're even have multiple touches on the image, but if you're using the same one in both, that's consistency there right away off the bat. Final question for you: any real world war experiences that you could share as well? Somebody who didn't listen and suffered for it.
Well, I'm in a lucky spot that most of the conversations that we're having, we're quite well advanced in the conversation. But some of them are interesting because you just somewhere in the next week or the following week, I'm having a conversation with a customer that started off with Nutanix, but Nutanix supports 3 hypervisors currently: Hyper-V, ESX, and Nutanix AHV, which is our own hypervisor. This particular customer started off with ESX. Now, given the friction on the market today, they're looking at alternatives to ESX, being AHV as being one of them. And we're doing workshops with them to kind of help them migrate from what they have today to Nutanix AHV. And I'm not saying it's a mistake or a war story, but it's definitely something that we're seeing more and more these days. One of the examples of a war story was a telco company that we work with, and they were using public cloud quite extensively. Majority was on a competitor to a Kirillos employer. They implemented Nutanix. They migrated a few thousand desktops over the weekend from that hyperscaler to on-prem, and now they're actually using similar methodology as Kirillos just displayed on his slide to make sure that there's proper placement of workloads. So instead of that cloud first mindset that you talked about, Shane, where people thought that everything would move to cloud, they're now actually a lot smarter because they have alternatives. They're looking at the workload, at the cost perspective, at kind of the parameters of that workload, and based on that, they'll determine if it's on-prem, if it's going to one of the hyperscalers, if it's going to be Azure with NC2 on top of it. So I'm not saying it's a war story as such. They didn't do anything bad, but given the technology that we have today, they have the stack to make more intelligent, more fact-based decisions on where to run their workload.
Yeah, good stuff. Thanks for that, Kees. So we've reached the questions part of our webinar, and I do have here. There's 2 here. Kirillos, one for you. We're still running our workloads on Windows Server 2012 R2. Is there a way that we can get extended security updates for these using Arc in Azure?
I think Vincent will be in a better place to explain all the options here.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, Vincent, I can hear you.
Just flicking between mute and not mute here for some reason. Yeah, just a quick introduction. Vincent Liffey is my name. I'm the channel manager for Azure here in Microsoft. So I work very closely with Kirillos. Kirillos obviously more from the technical side of things, and I work closely with partners such as Enterprise Solutions to make sure that they and their customers are aware of as far as the commercial supports that we can provide into the market across the unmanaged space in Ireland. Yeah, so Windows Server and SQL Server 2012 end of service or end of security updates and all the rest of it. There's a couple of options available to customers. And it's almost like this campaign was launched almost this time last year. I won't say it's almost the forgotten campaign, but it's one of those ones that's kind of going along in the background all the time. And just to mention that there's a couple of options for customers to consider to maintain ESU. Obviously, the first thing you need to check is, can your workload migrate to Azure? If the answer is yes to that, you simply move to Azure, and there's two options there. There's PaaS or IaaS. Obviously, with PaaS, there's no ESU needed because you move it onto a PaaS latest and greatest version of SQL. But if it is going to be Azure IaaS on a dedicated host, you can get free ESU by just moving that 2012 server into Azure. So that's quite an attractive thing that gets a lot of traction across the unmanaged space here at Microsoft. So lots of customers moving just to avail of that. And once you move it, you can select the ESU, the free ESU updates, and it's licensed under CSP. If the answer is no, that you can't migrate your workload to Azure, then there's still a number of options to use. So you have to remain on premise, and there's three main options. You modernize in place with Arc SQL, and no ESU is obviously required in that scenario. You can upgrade to Windows Server and SQL Server 2022. Obviously, no ESU needed there. But you can remain on-prem and register the server to Azure Arc. And if you do that in the standard offer, there is an option for a paid ESU, but you do require an active software assurance is required in both options. But you can register the server in Azure Arc for it to be controlled from Azure, even though it remains an on-prem server on 2012. There's an option for you to select a paid ESU to make sure you get those updates. I think there's just over 2 years left in that offer. So that would give you the time to, I suppose, modernize those workloads and bring it into a full either PaaS or IaaS solution in Azure on 2022. So there are the options available for customers to consider. I have a slide available on that. If anybody wants to see it, I can send it around afterwards. I presume there's going to be a pack sent around to customers here, and that'll be included in it if you so wish.
Yeah, we can add it to the deck that will be distributed with the recording. One here for you, Kees. You mentioned there's a lot of changes happening in the hypervisor space with VMware. Is this causing customers to talk to Nutanix more to see if it would work for them? And how I'm just going to say, how easy is it to go from ESX to AHV when you're already running supported hardware?
Well, if you just look at the stock price, and I don't have to comment on that, but if you look at where we were last year versus where we are now, it's up to 200%. So that gives you an indication on where the market think this is going. And I've said this before to people around me that there's no better place to work at Nutanix than where we are today. And it's not because we did something disruptive in the market just a few months ago. We started this journey 12 to 15 years ago, and we are where we are right now because of a lot of hard work in the product and into channel, into our customers. But we can definitely see that there is an uptick in partners and customers that are interested in alternatives, given the situation that the market is in. How easy is it to move from one hypervisor to another? And let me keep that very broad. Obviously, I've been in consultancy for way too long to give you a precise answer, so I'd say it depends. Yeah. But we do have tooling to help you with that. So there's a product called Nutanix Move, which allows you to move VMs, what's in the name, right? To migrate VMs from one hypervisor to another and back. So it doesn't lock you into AHV. It also gives you the opportunity to move away from AHV into a different hypervisor if you'd like, or maybe even to one of the hyperscalers. To move is actually kind of that spider in the web that allows you to go from one to another. Now that's just the kind of the logistics of a VM migration. If you look at more detailed solutions, there's one specifically to end user computing, and again, kind of in a DEX world. There's a well-written document by my team that will allow you, or which explains how to migrate CVAT or Citrix DAS from VMware to AHV. And that document is also hosted on portal.nutanix.com under solutions documentation. And it basically talks about the 3 or 4 options that you logically have to migrate from one to the other, keeping in consideration things like hosting connections, VM specifics, hypervisor specifics. If you're on VMware today, what is the equivalent of a certain technology or a certain setting in AHV to make sure that you have like a like for like environment as much as we can. So I think, to your question, how easy is it? It depends, but we try to make it as easy as possible.
Yep, and that's a fair answer. Yep. So just to start wrapping up here for all the attendees, just a reminder that if you attend all 3 of the webinars in the series, you will be in the competition for a voucher to invest in your happiness for a value of up to €1,000. So not only will you have happy users, happy IT, you'll also have happy yourself. For a spa day, gym membership, cooking classes, whatever you want to spend it on, anything that can help improve your happiness. Just before we wrap up, a reminder that the final webinar in the series is taking place on the 14th of May. And we're transforming your DEX using AI and modern access methods. You can scan that using the QR code that's on screen. I want to say a big thank you to my panelists today. A big thank you to Kirillos, Kees, and Vincent. Thank you for taking time out of the day to join us and have a conversation. Much appreciated.
My pleasure, Shane.
No problem at all.
And thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And hope to see you on the next one. Take care, everyone. Bye now.